record this thing. Thank you, Lorenzo. So,
hi everyone.
I'm sorry?
Hello.
Sorry, hi everyone.
Yes, hi. Yes, we are now recording. So we have to stop talking about our grand conspiracy to take over the world. So let me begin, though, by talking about an idea that came up on Sunday. One of the fellows had suggested a very different approach to personality modeling. He said, rather than trying to figure out what the best attribute, what best set of attributes is, why don't we base it on the archetypes in stories? That is, we could, could we somehow, there are these classic archetypes and there are many standard roles in many stories. Could we somehow use those as a kind of personality model? And I realized, well, what he's proposing wouldn't work by itself, but it did give me an idea for something else, and I'll try to explain this. This is complicated. It's called multidimensional analysis. And here's the way it proceeds. You start off with a set of characters in stories. And I decided that the best set to use would be the characters in stories that almost everybody has seen, and they're long stories. So we really know the characters well. We can't really use characters from, say, a single movie or a single book. But there are these series of movies like The Matrix or Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, Star Trek, Game of Thrones, where we've really gotten to know these characters well. Okay, so let's say we take all of those characters, all the primary characters in those stories, and that just gave me an idea. Let me write it down. Okay, and we take all those characters and we make a matrix. And we list each of the characters along the top and each of the characters along the side. And so we have this grid work of cells. And in that grid work, at the intersection of any two characters, we write down a number between 0 and 9, stating how similar or dissimilar they are. So a good example would be, here we go. In the Sauron in Lord of the Rings and Emperor, the Emperor in Star Wars. Palpatine, yes. Okay, those guys are really similar. They're both really bad. And so we'd list them, we'd put down a 0 there, meaning we're really measuring how close together they are dramatically. So we would say then that Sauron and Palpatine have a separation of 0. And then we would take, say, Luke Skywalker and boy, I'm getting old. The wizard, Gandalf, Luke Skywalker and Gandalf. And where they intersect, we put a number. Well, they're not really that much like, they're both nice. So we'll put a 5 in there. And so we go through putting in all of these numbers. Now, obviously, no single person can put in all those numbers. So we have to do this over the internet and get hundreds, or we hope even thousands, of people filling in whatever entries they can. And then we collect all this data. So now we have this huge data set showing for every pair of major characters in these stories how close together they are dramatically. And then I calculate the mean and standard deviation of that value. In other words, we had 1,000 people responding and 40 compared Gandalf with Luke Skywalker. And so I take those 40 numbers and figure the mean and standard deviation. Now I have a matrix with mean and standard deviation values at each point in the grid. Now at this point, I need to draw some pictures. Let's suppose here we go. Let's suppose that you had 3 characters with similarity, or I should say dissimilarity values between them. And let's say the first 2 characters are 6.3 apart, okay? But the third character, well, he's 1.9 away from this guy and 2.6 away from that guy. Well, this triangle doesn't work. The sides don't match. This can't be done. So we can't really graph 3 people in 2 dimensions. I mean, maybe we'll be lucky and they'll fit, but for most purposes, it won't work. However, if we go to 3 dimensions, we can make it work perfectly. It's easy to, find locations for these 3 people where they'll work perfectly. Okay, so you need, in order to get a perfect fit, you need as many dimensions as there are character pairs. So if we have, say, 50 characters, we'll need a 50-dimensional space to graph them all perfectly. Well, that's ridiculous. But wait, there is another trick. What if, instead of thinking of these as sticks, we think of them as springs? So they can be stretched or compressed. And so the spring has its natural length, which is 1.9 or 2.6 or 6.3. But we're just going to take 3 balls and link them together with these springs and let them go, and it'll go boing. And basically these springs will stretch and this spring will compress. And we can actually calculate, is very simple physics. We can calculate the net result, that is the distances they would settle down to, that would be the natural result, and this would be called the minimum energy condition. Okay, well, that's interesting. And in fact, we could put 500 balls with springs in them and we'd get this enormous tangle, but it could work, except for the fact that the springs would interfere with each other. So we could do something like that. And in fact, what we could do, let's say we're going to have 50 pairings. So we're going to need 50 dimensions to get 0 net energy. With 50 dimensions, it'll all fit perfectly, no problem. We go down to 49 dimensions, and there's going to be a little bit of stretching and compressing here and there. And as we cut down the number of dimensions, we get more and more stress. So theoretically, you would get a graph of stress versus the number of dimensions looking like this. If you have a lot of dimensions, you'll have very little stress, but as you have fewer and fewer dimensions, you'll have less and less stress. That's theoretically. In practice, though, what you'll get is a graph that I'm going to have to, well, no, I can. It might look, say, like this, with some high areas and some lower areas, and so forth. Now, this tells us something important. Where we see a valley, that means that there's a natural clustering with that many dimensions, that things fit a little better than you would otherwise expect them to fit. And so, and we get the same thing here. So we get two places where they kind of line up neatly, or at least they're neater. And that means that there's some kind of organization in there. So suppose these two valleys are at 10 and 20 dimensions, okay? So let's take that. Now this is all mathematical. You can't visualize any of it, but it's all, you know, the mathematics of 20-dimensional space is just the mathematics of 2 dimensions with more terms in it. It's all very simple. Okay, so let's take the 20-dimension minimum. Let's graph all of the, let's do the calculation that settles the springs down to the minimum energy, and then let's graph them all in that 20-dimensional space. And what you'll see almost certainly is clustering. You'll see little groups of dots. For example, you'll see Sauron and Palpatine in a little group along with all sorts of other evil people. And there might be a good guys group. And there might be a comic relief idiot group like C-3PO and Pippin. You know, we always have those guys. And then there might be a group of, you know, beautiful girls who provide romantic interest. And, you know, there'll be all kinds of little groups, each one representing a kind of a role. So we identify the groups. We do a little mathematical thing that says, all right, show me all the guys who are really close together. And then it'll come out and list, okay, here's one group and it has all these people in it. Here's another group and it has all those people. And this group has all these people. Okay, that would be interesting, but it wouldn't really tell us a great deal by itself. I mean, after all, yeah, of course, there are always villains and good guys and romantic interests and funny guys and so forth. But once we've got that figured out, then we go back and look at the coordinates of the center of each cluster. For example, let's take the villain cluster. And it has 20 coordinates because this is 20 dimensions, right? And so we just list its coordinates. 12, 3.1, 9.7, 6, you know, and we get this list of coordinates. And then we do it for each of the other groups. And then we compare them. And we say, you know, all the villains have a really high value of coordinate number 14. Whereas the good guys have a very low value of coordinate number 14. That tells us something about coordinate number 14. And in fact, you can figure out, you can then use those coordinates as ways of defining characters. In other words, you say, all right, any given character is going to be, you know, this list of 20 values, and that defines the character. That's still a little difficult because, let's face it, 20 characters is way too many, or 20 dimensions. But what if we looked at, say, 6 dimensions? And we could still find some grouping in there, some clusters, and it would be easier to identify each of the dimensions with something like a personality trait. We may not give it a name. We may notice that there's, you know, that there's something that the romantic interest has in common with the funny sidekick. we don't know what to call it, but we just say, all right, that's dimension number 5. And, you know, we can use that in our personality model. So this does require a lot of judgment. And right now, I'm sure it doesn't make any sense because it's just too complicated. However, I think as we proceed through, the first time I tried it, I had great difficulty figuring it out. But once I actually got into the numbers and started messing with it, actually, the way I did it was, God, nearly 40 years ago. I was at Atari Research, and we did an MDA analysis on video games. We took a bunch of the most popular video games. We did the grid work, you know, Space Invaders, Pac-Man, and so forth, Space Invaders, Pac-Man, and the grid work. How similar are they? And I think we boiled it down to 5 dimensions where we decided that was most useful. And it was very clear there was one dimension for the pace of the game, how frantic it was, how much you had to hurry. And there was another dimension for violence, how much killing you were doing. We came up with a number of good dimensions out of that. And we found it to be an interesting way to understand video game design. So we could do the same thing here. And I have written up a lengthy proposal for doing that. And here is the URL. And I suggest you look at it when you have some free time. It explains the whole process. Whoops. There we go. So you can look it over, see what you think. I will be wanting some help on this, although one fellow has already volunteered to do all of the web programming. I will do all of the statistical analysis programming. I've done it before, I know how to do it. It's easier for me to just do it than try to explain to somebody else how to do it. Let's see. However, I will also want from each of you your active participation in recruiting respondents. That is, we want to get a lot of people in this. The more people we get, the more useful our results will be. And in fact, the greatest risk of this project is that we won't get enough people. And the data simply won't be sufficient, and the clusters will be fuzzy, and the dimensions, you know, we won't get any really noticeable valleys or anything like that. So that's where each of you comes in. Are you willing to use your Twitter, Facebook, social media accounts to recruit people for this? Anybody can do it, you know, so long as you've seen, you know, some of these movie series, you can do it. Let me do a quick poll here. How many of you watched the PBS, this series, called Downton Abbey? If you have seen it, say yes. Nobody. That's pretty much what I thought. That's pretty much what I thought. So that was one. But am I safe to assume that, oh wait, here we go, Cornell Joho and James Piggott. Very good, very good. Okay, so we got 3. So maybe we could use Downton Abbey. On the other hand, I think I'm pretty safe assuming that the vast majority of people we talk to are going to know Star Wars, Star Trek, Lord of the Rings, The Matrix, Game of Thrones. I think, am I safe in assuming that most people know at least 4 out of those 5?
Yeah.
Okay.
You
So,
probably toss in Harry Potter in there too if you want.
yes, Harry Potter is on the list
Potter's
as
here.
well. In fact, if you look at the bottom of that page, it's got the, let's see, Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, Matrix, Harry Potter's. Oh, but it doesn't have Star Trek in it. I failed on that. Oh, well. I'll include it soon. One problem with Star Trek is that there are a lot of characters spread out over time. So it might be difficult. We'll see. Let's see.
It might also be interesting to include cartoons.
Well, it has to be a series. Well, I mean, it has to be, these have to be characters that are really well known.
Perhaps some Marvel characters would be from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They're quite.
I actually have, I don't like the idea of using the Marvel characters. The reason, or any of the, what I'll call comic book characters, because comic book characters are extreme caricatures. That is, you don't get that that much. Here we go. Comic book characters are to say Downton Abbey as a candy bar is to steak tartare. You know, there's not a lot of subtlety here. You know, candy is like, wow, that tastes great. My tongue is just jumping up and down with pleasure. Whereas, you know, French cooking, you know, there's such a taste, there's an odor, and it's a texture. That's not French. Sorry, I can't do French. Anyway, you know, there are matters of subtlety here. Now, the fact is, we want to do comic book characters for getting started. We don't want to have complex characters like what we get in, say, Tolstoy's War and Peace. You know, characters who say, should I do the good thing, but I have my loyalty, but then I'll make more money doing that. Oh, I don't know what to do. You know, comic book characters, you know, bad guy, kill him. So I'm really torn about that, but in general, I think it would be worthwhile to have two experiments. One with just comic book characters, the other with other kinds of characters. So, yeah, choosing the right set of characters is the first task. It is open to debate right now. Now is the time to decide it. Joho suggests Simpsons. Yeah, how many people? Maybe, here we go. I think what I'll do is I will send out an email to everyone asking them to vote on which of the story series they personally could respond to. And we'll see what we, you know, we'll just go with whatever people know well. Disney characters, ooh, tough, tricky business. Disney doesn't do many series. Most of its characters are one-offs. Now, they can be very good one-offs, but boy, you get into issues like, well, for example, Beauty and the Beast. Which Beauty and the Beast do you do? There have been 3 that I know of. So, I mean, there's, yeah, there are an awful lot of possibilities. So, Mad Men, that I doubt many people know very well. Oh, the Greek myths, biblical stories. Yeah, let's just, I'll just put together a poll.
There's also an interesting piece where we're looking for things people know about with long story arcs, but we also don't want really lots of character like change over time, because it's like what Avatar: The Last Airbender, you get Zuko, where he starts off way over on one side, and then over the course of 3 seasons, he ends up way on the other side. So which Zuko are we talking
Yeah,
about?
yeah, good
So
point, good point.
there's like, you don't want like a fully rounded. You still want a flat character, but you want a flat character that people are really familiar with.
Yeah, and in all of these series, we do see some character development. Nevertheless, for example, Luke Skywalker. This guy we go through his entire life, and he goes through all sorts of changes. Nevertheless, I think it's safe to say that there is a persistent personality that we can assign to Luke, and he merely matures within that character. I don't know. Let's see. Oh, Mechanical Turk. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and Strawpole. Red Riding Hood. See, a lot of the fairy tales, folk tales and such, the characters aren't really well developed because the stories are so short. Like Red Riding Hood, you know, the wolf, the woodsman, grandma, not much, you know, these are fairly straightforward characters, so there isn't much. How do you compare Red Riding Hood with Princess Leia? You know, so, okay, I will put together a character poll, which I will send to all of the students. Breaking Bad, well, you know, I can put it on the list, but I doubt that will, you know, there might be a way for me to find.
Are you interested in series that are particularly cross-generational? Because there are different series will be more popular to different generations. Like something from the
Downton
50s per
Abbey.
se. Yeah, Downtown Abbey would be more popular with an older demographic, which is probably why a
Us
lot of us
old
haven't seen it.
farts. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, the comic book stuff is more popular with the younger people. And my guess is, because we're doing this over social media, we will be looking at younger people. Ergo, you know, we don't want something like Downton Abbey. And again, that argues for more of the comic movies. Still, from the few comic movies I've seen, I've watched a number of the Batman movies and a couple others. The characters just aren't that interesting or rich, or you know, they compare well within their universe, but they don't. I mean, how do you compare? You know, the Joker in Batman with Darth Vader or anybody for that matter. You know, there's just the comparisons don't work.
Yeah,
So,
maybe I think the more modern, particularly Nolan's Batman movies, I think that those characters might hold up. I think those characters would hold up the more recent Joker and Bane in particular. There's some similarities, I think, with Darth Vader and so forth.
well, I would. I think my tentative conclusion is we need to keep those dramatic universes very separate. And
Yeah, it's a muddy field because there's been so many interpretations of these characters, especially with something like the superheroes or Batman or the Joker, particularly. Like how many well-known adaptations of the Joker are there now?
yeah. Oh boy. Yeah, there's a lot of confusing stuff here. But the argument that really bothers me is that for our initial efforts, we really are going to need to be more like comics than War and Peace. So I don't know. I need to think about this some more, but I'll send out a poll and we'll see. So maybe we can talk about lesson number 9 now, about numbers. And here, let me jump straight to that. I want to start off by pointing out the numbers you use really have a powerful influence upon the way you build things. Now, that may not be as evident to you as it is to me, because I started off using 8-bit bytes for my calculations, and then went to 16 bits, and then finally jumped to floating point. And oh, and I've also used hexadecimal. There's lots of different number systems, and they really do have a powerful influence on your work. And there are a few basic lessons I have learned. One is that you've got to use floating point in some way, because you get too many problems with discrete transitions. For example, role-playing games, or some of the interactive story worlds coming out of Santa Cruz and so forth. They'll rate a character, some personality trait, as an integer between 0 and 10. And that doesn't work at all, because when you jump from X to Y, or from X to X plus 1, you can get a dramatic change in the number of people. Oh, Joho, we have 2 entries for you, or 2 existences. Anyway, the example I like to use is, let's talk about a romantic story world in which the boy learns that he can get the girl to like him more if he gives her roses. He gives her some roses, she likes him a little bit more. So, okay, do that 1,000 times more. And she loves me. And, that's just stupid. That's actually not so much a problem with. Basically, if you're using integers, then either the effect is so small that he's stuck at 6 and he just can't get up to 7 no matter how many times he does it, or it's big enough that if he does it a lot of times, he gets infinite results. Both of those are unacceptable. That's why I ended up using this bounded number system, where the numbers fall between -1 and +1, and the transform is guaranteed that under no circumstances, -1 corresponds to -infinity, and +1 corresponds to +infinity, and so you cannot reach either value. One nice thing about this is that it corresponds nicely to a lot of personality traits, in that it produces, I won't say a bell curve, but something that vaguely looks like a bell curve. And and so right in the middle, 0, you have normal, average, everyday, typical, usual. So if you've got a personality trait like bad, good, then somebody who's 0 bad, good is your normal, average, everyday person, mostly good and a little bit bad, whatever. And then you can rate people relative to that. So a +0.99 is a saint, and a -0.99 is really, really evil. So, and you assume that people fall along this nice distribution in between. Now, in all honesty, I would prefer to use something more like a normal or Gaussian binomial distribution, a true bell curve. The problem is those aren't bounded at 0. Now, it turns out that that's not necessarily an impediment, but it does make life a little more confusing. The real problem, though, is the inversion process, going back and forth, doing calculations with that. Actually, that might best be done with a table-driven process. I don't know. But in any case, the bounded numbers, especially when combined with a blend operator, are in fact the best way to do this. And I base this on just decades, literally, of experience. I just messed around with lots and lots of numbers and number systems. And what I've zeroed in on is bounded numbers with the blend operator are the easiest mathematical system to use for doing calculations with personality issues. So that's first thing. Any questions about bounded numbers in general? Let's see. I'm looking at this screenshot. Oh, okay. Oh, nice. Oh, you've already done the calculations, huh?
I was going to type this, but I might as well just speak. Yeah, I went deep down the rabbit hole in this because I'm designing a prototype myself right now and found the hyperbolic tangent to be very similar to bounded numbers. And it's just the difference of like the graph being a little less smushed. Here. Or at least that's what it seems like looking at this graph.
Here?
So I labeled it. So this is the. I can show you actually my full window here that I have.
Well, what are the two axes?
Oh, the two axes. This is just the formula graphed on a XY axis. And the variables are X and Y.
So Y
here, I'll show you
the number of X.
X is the input, Y is the output.
Okay, so Y equals B number of X.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Here, I'll show you.
Yes.
This screenshot shows the formulas that are being graphed.
Yeah. That is, in fact, let me expand that. Yeah. Okay, so they both asymptotically approach one. Yeah, that's a good point.
What's the primary advantage to each one? Is one computationally less expensive, or is this just like, hey, this is cool, these two things are similar, and if we need something that accelerates faster, then use the tangent, and if we need something that accelerates slower, use the B number?
You could do that. I mean, it really doesn't matter that much. About the only no, I can't. Either one will work. Yeah. Tang is mathematically has the same properties that we need in a in this kind of function.
Mm-hmm.
So you could use either one. I see no reason to prefer one over the other. Although I will point out the blend operator, could you build a correlate? Yeah, sure. you could build a correlate of the blend operator for the Tanch operator. Yeah, that could be done. So I don't see any good arguments either way. So yeah, sure, use whichever one.
I did notice that, how do you, is it use tang?
When I was in school 50 years ago, my math professor called it Tanch.
Tanch. Oh, okay. I noticed Tanch, when the numbers are smaller, they're much closer to just a linear function. And that's not true for B numbers.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, Tanch remains linear right up, I mean, up through about 0.5. Is that desirable? Basically what it means, see, and most people you expect to fall within minus 0.5 to plus 0.5. If you're thinking of this as a distribution of an attribute. Interesting question. I actually did at one point have some reservations about the properties of the bounded number and looked into various schemes to modify the curve a bit, for example, by using exponents on x. I looked at a variety of possibilities there and concluded that, well, you know, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Ultimately, this is an artistic decision, and in fact, perhaps we could, at some point in the future, we might want to have a system for bounded numbers that can be where there are multiple functions defined by an exponent attached to the x value. The mathematical analysis of bounded numbers gets us into a lot of subjective artistic questions about how strongly people should react to various perturbations, and there just aren't any good answers to that. So my guess is we will get, our best guidance will come from experience. That is, after somebody has built a bunch of story worlds, they'll be able to say, you know, in general, I find that characters respond too quickly at low values and not fast enough at high values. So I want to shift that curve a bit. But we have to have that experience before we can make that decision. So, but that's good. Pardon?
Oh, sorry. I was just wondering for Mark, have you looked at the performance characteristics of those calculations? The reason I ask is, like, if we have very large tables, it might that may be being processed frequently. There may be some benefit to using I think the lower of those two is the tangent function, and
the higher of the two, I believe.
Well, it depends on what quadrant you're looking at.
Yeah. That's,
pardon me.
yeah.
I mean, so over on the left on the second screenshot, the y equals e to the 2x.
That's the tangent one. I could have also typed it out as tan h, but that's the long form of it with the
Okay.
e.
Okay. Yeah. So I'd be curious about which one is which one performs faster, because if I've got a table of, you know, as the size of the table approaches infinity.
I actually discovered this function by researching machine learning.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the functions that's very commonly used to bind numbers into a into the -1, +1 range.
Oh, Oh,
for
bounded numbers. I
yeah.
didn't realize they did that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, they'll use sigmoid to use take it to 0 to 1, tang to take it to 1 to -1, and they also have a very common one as well is softmax to take all of the numbers and make percentages out of them. However, which function is used, it's all a very quick computation for the computer.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think we have to worry about cycles.
And the difference between the computations is marginal enough where it's not really anything to worry about. Usually, at least, well, in machine learning land, you're more worried about optimizing other things, which is because you're in machine learning, you're usually waiting for a couple of minutes or hours or days, depending on how large your data set is. And that's because of how much data there is, not because of the computation.
Right.
That's
Right.
being
But
done
once you've trained your model over the 3 weeks or whatever it takes you to crank it, then then it should be really easy. Okay. All right. Cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Luckily, computers are now fast enough to take most of what we throw at it at this space that we can imagine in our heads.
Oh, geez, you guys. I mean, you don't remember the days of 1 megahertz processors with 8-bit. You're so spoiled. Anyway, let's see. Let's move on now to lesson 10 on the blend operator. That's, in my opinion, what really makes this thing work. I found blend is phenomenally useful. It's a rather odd function, and it's a little difficult to appreciate at first, but what I found, in fact, I started off with a whole bunch of operators to work in bounded number situations. I had an addition, a subtraction, a bounded number, multiplication, and division, although those, it turned out, were very unreliable. They could produce really weird results. I had a bunch of them. But I kept finding that blend would do everything I needed, and it did so very well. So I now believe that for the purposes of what we're doing, for getting started, I really believe strongly that people should just use bounded numbers and blend. And once we've developed some experience with those, I expect that we'll start seeing more interesting mathematical variations on them. But those variations have to be based on actual experience with story worlds. I think that's the crucial factor that we lack right now. So we won't really find the weaknesses in the bounded number system and the blend operator until we've used them a lot. I know that they are very practical, easy to use, blah, blah, blah. They work. So they're a good place to start, but I expect we'll be able to do better once we built up some experience. Oh, well, yeah, Lorenzo. For real-time stuff, yeah, you sweat cycles. But interactive storytelling is not going to be sweating cycles. This is an important point, though, that somebody raised on Sunday. And that is that you can't do, or they didn't say this, this was my retort to them. No, you don't want to mix 3D graphics with interactive storytelling. It's just, it's going to screw you up because 3D graphics emphasize spatial reasoning. 3D graphics are a way of seeing space, and you can look around in a 3D space. And that's not really what we're worried about here. We're worried about dramatic reality, in which you are concerned primarily with how people feel and react to events. So really any kind of 3D graphics is a huge distraction. Now this leads to a conclusion that I'm sure many of you will find distasteful, and that's that your primary input and output are going to be fundamentally textual in nature. Basically, we're going to just be spitting out text. And a lot of game designers look at that and say, oh, yuck, how boring. Well, the complexity takes place inside the machine, and the text that comes out, it reflects some very complicated decisions. Let me mention there are there are three basic ways to output text. The most common way is to simply write some text down and spit it out, and you end up spitting out the same text over and over and over, like in text adventures, and it very quickly becomes quite off-putting. I developed an improvement on that that would have been 1984, that I call Tinker Toy text, that I have expanded enormously. This is a textual structure with all sorts of embedded variables in it, and which allows you to build a basic sentence that can generate 3 million variations. The variables are things like inserting the text values of certain variables. Insert the name of the person, insert the name of this prop. That's easy. Another is intensifiers. And you can do this two ways. One is to have a lot of custom intensifiers, specific instantiated intensifiers, and one is to have generic intensifiers. These are just things that make something bigger or stronger. John kissed Mary perfunctorily, or he kissed her devotedly. He kissed her lovingly. He kissed her passionately. You can do those types of intensifiers. But then you also get into adverbs, and adverbs are a bad idea here. If you want to have a slightly different if you want to use an adverb, just use a different verb. Let's see. And then I came up with multiple adjectives, multiple clauses even. That's what really differentiates it. However, I found that it took so much time writing up a good Tinker Toy sentence that ultimately it wasn't worth the effort. If we had $1 million budgets, then yeah, we could have a whole room full of writers creating lots of these things, and it would be better. But for now, Tinker Toy text is something to experiment with. You can look it up on my website. Just search for the phrase Tinker Toy text, and there's some stuff on it on my website. Then there's, and then the third thing I came up with, which is what I'm experimenting with now, is completely customized text with numerous variations, or numerous instantiations. That is, I have this, I can't explain it right now. It's this extended encounter system that I'm building, and it won't make sense until you actually see it running. So let's see. Strategy games can have nice 3D graphics. Yeah, sure, but strategy games aren't storytelling. Let's see. Problem is, if you want to generate graphics procedurally, but some games have nice graphics that are procedurally generated to add diversity. Okay. Yeah, but again, that doesn't apply to storytelling. The one area where you do want graphics in storytelling, and in fact, I'll go even further and say where you must have graphics, is in facial displays. You absolutely, positively must have technology for showing faces with emotions on. And at this point, I'll be talking about facial stuff in a later lesson. But what I'll say for now is that faces are extremely important. 3D stuff, yeah. You can do very good 2D faces. Although 3D is of some value for faces, for certain facial expressions, where, you know, oh, really? There are some places where you get head rotation as part of an emotional expression, or, you know, the various head tilts, but like this and so forth. But even that, you can do a lot of that with just 2D rotation. So, in fact, I've always ended up using 2D. Well, again, we'll talk about it when we come to that lesson. So let's see. So conclusion, for now, use the bounded number system I developed and use the blend operator I developed. You can also, I do use addition. It turns out addition has some value. It's a function, an operator I call bsum, but here, why avoid bringing a 3D environment into a story world? In ethology, many animal behavior traits are based on environment. The polygamy threshold model is a mathematical model for mating behavior based on territory, food supply. I would think that human behavior is also environmental. No, it isn't. At least not dramatic behavior. That is, most human dramatic behavior is linguistic. For example, it is trivially easy to have an entire story that takes place in a single location. You don't need space to tell a story. It is almost impossible to tell a good story without in some way using language. Now, there have been some very interesting animations done, though. They're meant to be international, and so they have no language in them. They, however, rely on an awful lot of graphic standards that have now become part of animation. For example, one animation is if the person leans back and you see little droplets coming out of their head, that means they're surprised. Well, that doesn't correspond to anything in the real world, but it's a standard, a protocol that we all recognize. Animation has developed so many of these standards that that we can now say quite a bit with animation. Still, language remains crucial to storytelling, and space is of very little significance in storytelling. People are either, if you look at the way space is used in movies, it's very quantized. That is, there are stages, and every character on a stage can interact with every other character on that stage. And if you're not on the stage, you can't interact. And when you want to interact with somebody else, you simply disappear from that stage and reappear on the other stage. That's how drama works. By the way, I also want to mention here, we really need to embrace the thinking and the terminology used in drama. So instead of thinking in terms of space, think in terms of stages. Instead of talking in terms of things or objects, think about props and characters and roles. Those things are especially good. Yeah, silent movies. That's a good point. And yes, there's a great deal of other stuff going on here, especially if you watch some of the real masters of silent movies like Charlie Chaplin. However, those again are not based primarily on space, but on excellent use of body and facial expressions. I spend a lot of time watching silent movies to see the language of to learn about the language of communication that they use. And it is a very impressive language. And again, Charlie Chaplin is very, very good at using his body to express emotions. But space is not an important component of that. So, okay, bye, Colin. Okay, well, we are out of time. So are there any last questions? Okay, then. Well, I will close this meeting and send out that character poll and see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.